Okie dokie. All right. Welcome to the prep for Wednesday office hours. We're doing Mizuoka chapter 7, and maybe part of chapter 8. 7 is a briefer chapter. As I mentioned before, um, we'll be looking at the difference between an action space and a Wirkungsraum. Wirkungsraum. And the difference, of course, is one that's more, sort of sub subjectively uh, sort of oriented, one that is more um, individualized in that sense, in terms of a subject. And on the other hand, space, that action space happens within the context of something that is more institutional, and that has to do with power. And that's where we'll get to in chapter 9. But we're going through chapter 7, and we're going to get there eventually. As I said, this is a shorter chapter. We'll probably start chapter 8. And I'm just going to go read through it in that sense. And then I'll be able to do, commentary on this on Wednesday. This chapter covers the native. Let me talk a little bit about it has an outline, the autogenous bond of space and body. So we're talking about a subject in space, right? A person in space. It has a phenomenological presence. It has ontological implications, etc. So the first section is on spatial configuration and lived space carved into the body. So you could argue, not that I'm going to argue that there is a kind of inscription that goes on. 7.2, section 7.2 is the manipulation and alienation of the autogenous bond by state and economic powers. Unless you think that's unimportant, that's kind of what's going on in the United States now, is state power is being abused, manipulated. People are being, snatched off the street, whether they are or aren't citizens or whatever. It's obviously manipulation and alienation of an autogenous bond. You don't feel like you're a member of the society. You feel, as though you are other, or and there are people running around who would hurt you while they're doing it. So the whole issue of controlling the body, it's Foucauldian in that sense, but it's simply, oppression, repression. 7.3 is manipulation of cognitive space. So we're talking about, more physical space as compared to a cognitive space. And this relationship, we are only sensate beings in a world, and the social relation issue is not simply because we're moving around and it's, we're just kind of bumping into each other. Rather, it is, you intentionally occupy a space, or you defect from it and intentionally hide from it in that sense. Some of us don't go out very often because you never know, something stupid will happen, and it's not like it's never happened. So the fact that it's happened a little bit is a little distressing. So anyway, the manipulation of cognitive space by state and economic power. Abstract. This chapter covers the native, sorry, the native and contrived bond of body and mind with space, termed the autogenous bond of space and body. The configuration of relative space becomes a part of the native human mind and body in various ways autogenously through the quotidian contact of the human with space. Now, all that seems pretty obvious, but I think people, you know, you can argue that we only know our sense of space. This is one way of arguing it, because we're ambulatory. That is, we move through space. So anyway, however, as Ueno points out in the case of Minamata disease, the state and capitalist power destroy the environment and alienate this intimate autogenous bond. Now, autogenous bond could be described, it's being in one with nature, whatever how you can describe it in a variety of ways, being in the landscape, being aware of one's place in the universe, etc., except in obviously a much more direct way. The autogenous bond, right? Power artificially attempts to contrive this bond, as demonstrated in the construction of the Catholic Church, as the spiritual center in Hanoi by France as a past colonial power and Disneyland in the contemporary world. The idea, of course, is that, space can be recolonized. It always is colonized. I mean, its history is one of colonizing in that sense. So on the one hand, you have the in the in a colonial context, you have the imperial or colonial power that sort of sits in the background and is always sort of there. It doesn't necessarily, engage you directly every day of your life, but these other factors are institutional elements are there. Similarly, without getting too far off the field, Disneyland operates in a very controlled environment and is colonizing or imperial in that sense. They don't sell chewing gum, for example, at Disneyland, and why did they do that? I mean, it's universal. I mean, you can't buy a stick of gum in Disneyland, mainly because it's just makes a mess of, you have to get out there and chisel off bubble gum or gum from the the sidewalk. So that's just one way of keeping streets more pristine, and you can get that sense of. Now, it's not the same pristine space that Mizuoka is sort of referring to. It's a much more mundane version of it, but one without gum on the ground is probably a good thing. Similarly, and not to make it too extreme, there's an anti-spitting law in Singapore, for example. It's $500 if you spit on the sidewalk. And, for some people, it's just normal thing is that you need to expectorate. Where are you going to expectorate? You don't, put it in a tissue and throw it away or put it in your pocket. Rather, some people spit in the street. Tuberculosis be damned. But you can see how that operates. Anyway, now, so this book has thus far discussed the production of physical space. We produce physical space by our engagement with it, right? It in part constitutes the forces of production, a role originally played by nature, which the social space displaced and supplanted. This is Lefebvre talking. This whole engagement of how is it that we produce space because we are in it. And of course, it's, Marxian in that sense. As a productivist kind of idea, but it's also that we circulate in that space as well. Another aspect of nature that constitutes space is the human body and its mind. In fact, the whole of social space proceeds from the body, even though it so metamorphoses the body that it may forget it altogether, even though it may separate itself so radically from the body as to kill it. That's a little denser there. The particular economic and social relationships embodied in the elements of the built environment pierce through time, as landscape theory posits. where the power structure of the past is frozen and preserved in the bodies of the subservient people, projecting the past power into the future. So you could argue that, yes, there are class differences. There are, you know, a more extreme version of that, of course, is gated communities, apartheid. Um, power structures are extant in that sense. Those people won't live here, or as with George Zimmerman, the that kid with the Skittles and the iced tea doesn't belong here, even though he's lived there. And so therefore I'm going to stand my ground, pull out my gun, and accost him. So anyway, this chapter analyzes how the body, which is along with space and in space, as well as nature by default, is alienated and removed from it. So alienating a body is no different than this idea of, boundaries, containers, territories, that all the things we've been talking about in terms of, sort of creating a dealing with this idea of space is also reflected in one's bodily relation, the autogenous relation. So 7.1, spatial configuration and lived space carved into the body. Lived space carved into the body. The autogenous bond of space and body. The spatial configuration is engraved not only as a physical form on the ground surface as the built environment, a physical form on the ground surface as the built environment, but also in the mental aspect of the human body of the laborers and subservient people. So, it may seem unkind or stupid, but they're the people who go take advantage of service industries, unfortunately treat the people who work in the service industries as something as subservient, etc. And needless to say, people abuse the kind of contract, the social contract you have with that level of laboring, and often people are quite elitist or insecure or whatever in that kind of set of relations. The landscape consists of the built environment and physical nature, topography, and flora, no fauna, flora, which is the property of physical geography. It takes a configuration similar to the gestalt of psychology as a whole, and the common signs of the place. Common signs of the place. Remember, we talked about place before, that it wasn't, that it's a much more specific version of space and place. Or as Sun Ra says, space is the place, but that's a different thinking about it. The common signs of the place are engraved. I know engraved is not good. Inscribed would be better, but anyway, engraved in the body of the subservient people who were born and raised in the same place. Unless you think that's unimportant, in certain parts of the United States, for example, there are different proportions of intersectional populations. So certain people are seen as more indigenous, even though very few people are indigenous. And in fact, even the indigenous people migrated here, but let's not go there. That some people are seen more like the furniture as opposed to other people. So there's a status, conflict, and has to do with power and status and all those usual things. Unless you think that's unimportant, it operates every damn day. These kinds of rules exist, even in places where you think, oh, this doesn't happen in a highly civilized cosmopolitan area. No, it does. I can tell you that it does. I have experienced it. This is not something we make up. So or those who lived there in the past for a long time. So that's like the indigenous folks. Even after the state power has come into control of space, as the society transforms itself into an agricultural one, to a household of peasants. The land he works and the village in which he lives may still seem to him as a natural entity, as the place to which he belongs emotionally and spiritually. I know someone who describes it as the place where one's memories are. Of course, that's a literature person talking about that, but you can see how that kind of operates, that one's whole sense of the world is one sense of place, is configured with these kinds of sense of belonging to the environment in that sense. So anyway, back to the text. The peasants thus have a sense of belonging to a place. Now, belonging, does that grant the same, level of status, et cetera, et cetera? That's that could be seen as a problematic issue. So let's just hold that thought for a moment and consider Robert Sachs points out that in primitive society, space and experience are so intimately interrelated. Lefebvre identified spatiality as the perceived, the conceived, and the lived. That is, representation of the space and representational spaces. The spaces proper to each faculty, from the sense of smell to speech, the gestural and the symbolic, unless you think that's unimportant. Developing countries or just traveling, some places smell different, and they're deeply different. The smell is deeply different for all the usual reasons. The whole body is thus integrated into social space, especially when the cognition is more primitive, as in one's childhood or in pre-modern society. So, without getting into a long lecture on it, there's a whole, the Piaget, et cetera, that you can talk about a child's sense of space, which is not simply the perception of a pristine space, but one that is largely, that has ambulatory elements. But anyway, the process of integration emerges through the autogenous process, just as a baby learns to acquire its native language through exchange with other humans, especially with its parents. And, some of us are just cursed with, the voices of our parents, that they are inscribed in us. And we've only, it takes work to escape that or modify one's, whatever, construct oneself in ways that aren't simply influenced by, the familial relations. Anyway, back to the text. Lefebvre further points out it is indeed a space at once and indistinguishably mental and social, which comprehends the entire existence of the group concerned. Lefebvre, well, I would call it, that's Mizuoka, would call it the autogenous bond of space and body. Here, space includes not only pristine space, as Mizuoka's defined it, but also produced space in the Lefebvrean sense as an outcome of space subsumption and physical nature. So subsumption, describes this kind of engagement, this kind of set of actions, this set of transformations, this kind of cognition in that sense. The autogenous bond is a notion of space that we often hold in our intellectual development from infancy to adulthood, and especially in the early stages of human development from primitive to increasingly advanced civilization. The most primitive and fundamental aspect of the relationship between the body and its outer space, the autogenous combination of space and the body, is thus created and persists. There's a certain enduring sense of that you are in the world, as opposed to, in a in a depth tank or something. In the same way that infants acquire native language, they acquire the property of space surrounding their bodies to create the intimate bond, or no, sorry, the innate bond of space and their own body. Now, there's a whole literature on this relative to environmental psychology, et cetera, et cetera. Let's not go there yet. Spatial awareness in childhood remains self-centered and subjective. It is known that when a child is asked to draw a cognitive map, he or she draws a place strongly related to him or herself, or a place which gives him or her a comfortable feeling, more conspicuous and larger than other spaces. You can imagine cognitive maps, the whole construction of cognitive maps is, on the one hand, therapeutic, on the other hand, revelatory, and there's a literature for it, et cetera. Furthermore, the infant has no awareness of the property relations of space independent of its material property. So already the sense of difference is there, or not there. A child tries to attach his or her own cognition of ownership to various elements of space through his or her own subjective judgment without being able to judge sufficiently whether the particular spatial element is actually under their own exclusive control or ownership, under control or ownership of others, or is used as a non-exclusive commons. So many people or children are less aware that there are social constraints. So you're not supposed to go walk over there. You're not supposed to transgress that boundary. You're not supposed to go up there through that door, blah, blah, blah. The place, back to the text, place where people have been living in a certain social space from their childhood is embedded within the mentality of the subject and becomes an innate part of his or her body. We do have those memories for the most part until you lose it. As a field of the autogenous binding of space and body, words such as furusato in Japanese, or Heimat, and which is homeland, right? And Heimlich in German represent a territory or place supported by real economic and social experiences of a body. That's the presumption of, homeland security, right? Some people only define it for certain people as opposed to a homeland because we migrate to it, and most of us are migrants. Anyway, this phenomenon, back to the text, this phenomenon also manifests itself in a group. For example, the people living in the same city or territory for a considerable period. However, in general, the recognition of the social property of the space matures as the subject grows and independent personality is established. That difference between one's sense of home as the place where you are and grow up, and the neighborhood, et cetera, and the right to the space of the self and the respect of other persons to it, as well as the cooperativity in the group related to the social space, grows among the members of the group. Now, we see that's, problematic because some people, think you don't belong here, or you don't look like you're from here, or, all those profiling things that, we currently are more aware of simply because people are abusing that set of relationships, acting unconstitutionally, needless to say. At the same time, the range of perceived space also expands in the recognition of the multi-layered spatial configuration in which the lower spatial scale becomes nested into the layers of higher spatial scale is formed in the body. The cognitive map of a child becomes gradually more objective, and the reference frame comes closer to the surveyed maps. In this way, the recognition of space matures and becomes more objective. Let me break here for a second. This is how one perceives dimensionality, right? This is how one projects oneself to use maps, for example. why some people have issues with it, because they were never, there's a whole thing about it, whether you are or aren't properly oriented or don't adapt properly to it. And there's lots of psychology work on that. Yet, back to the text, yet it does not completely become identical with the contiguity and separation. Remember, we're talking about continuity versus separation in terms of pristine space. The contiguity and separation drawn in a surveyed map does not completely become identical with contiguity and separation drawn in a surveyed map. Even the everyday spatial cognition of adults living in a civilized society is developed to a considerable extent based on a relative framework consisting of a set of meanings, a set of values, of places given to space. Remember, that's the difference. That place, has, a kind of a meaning construction in a space. The intensity and contrast of the meanings is often associated with the pristine or artificial separation or contiguity. So, right, when the spatial mobility of an individual or a social group is restricted, distorted spatial images and values are more likely to result. As the child comes of age, he or she is likely to begin experiencing this alienation from once intimate space. And let me break here for a second, and you know that this is kind of what goes on. This is, the thing that you expect in that children have a certain, sense of space that should not be violated, which adults can and often do, which is, the horrors of human society. Subsection B, inscription of pristine and subsumed space in the mentality. A body as a biological substance bound in space becomes an integral part of relative space, The body determines direction of, this is left, right, top, and bottom, as well as distance, all of which are the properties of relative space. Note that there's lexical differences, and this exists cross languages, right? Things are to the left, things are to the right. There's a kind of Cartesian sort of sense, certain ideas of symmetry of our bodies in the world, etc. Lefebvre points out the level of singularities stretches outward around bodies, unquote. The units of measurement of distance, such as feet and inches, were derived from size of parts of the body, right? Feet as in foot, the thing at the end of your leg, this is the cubit in the Bible, etc. A part of a body is also used to describe the built form in physical space, as for example, phallic verticality. Oh, yeah. The relational space inscribed in the body as a mental map or mental map components attaches positive or negative value to the components in the relational space and becomes the norm or guideline for the behavior of a person. So some people behave better or worse. Some people violate space. Some people, get in your face, whatever. These kinds of things happen. The interconnectedness of spatial elements, such as the built environment and physical landforms carved in the brain, is reflection of the objective network of spatial configuration. Reflection of the objective network of spatial configuration. This cognitive space is not necessarily an exact reflection of the pristine and built relational space, topography, or vegetation. A person tends to remember strongly what he or she cares most about, what he or she enjoys, or what he or she often experiences. So you have a kind of preference ordering, right? Yet the feature is distorted with loaded values for each individual. If a believer in a religion has a common representation of a topographical feature and recognizes that God exists in it, then the topographical feature is understood as if it contains supernatural forces. And yes, we know that this exists for many people, that, sacred, so-called sacred spaces in that particular sense. Then the topographical feature is understood as it contains supernatural forces. In geography, the individual points within pristine space that has been established with certain relationships with others in social mutual understanding are called place, right? Individual points within pristine space that has relationships with others is place. And when the place is reified as having a certain power in society, they are called, this is Mizuoka, right? Spatial fetish. It is this sense of, applying a fetish in the sense of, not in the perverse sense, but rather as in commodity fetishism, as Marxian anthropology sort of looks at it, as Marx himself talks about it. A sense of spiritual belonging to a place of origin is constantly created and enhanced through daily life experience. It is a derivative of the common homing instinct found in with other creatures. Homing pigeons, right? The autogenous the bound of space and subject persists in consciousness of the subject, the children and adults like, as the most innate spiritual base of a person, as the association with the biological parents or the native language. We remember the neighborhood in which we grow up, etc. This spiritual sense of belonging to the features of relational space triggers and motivates religious or social actions based on one's faith. In this sense, a spatial fetish is an objective, factual aspect in the sense that there is a fact that space is inscribed in the human body rather than a complete falsehood or empty subjectivity. So, there is this, you're trying to set that there is something there as opposed to nothing or, absence in that sense. When many people share a particular understanding or value of a place, it can become a quote unquote place of hope or a place of stigma. And, there's numerous examples of this in terms of monuments, etc. In this way, the system of relational space receives the mental image of groups, which in turn creates their own map of relational space in the mind of each person. Such relational space, colored with the common imagery of living space, strengthens the sense of community as quote unquote local class alliances, David Harvey, and the concept of the local inhabitants are simply the locals. It can affect the industrial location as the tendency of a family-owned company to set up its manufacturing plant in its hometown. As the proverb, return to one's hometown loaded with honors, aptly expresses. Subsection C, past discussions on this topic by Marxist and humanistic geographers. However, this inscription is never harmonious or stable in the class society under private ownership. This is the libertarian problem. I got my stuff, screw off, whatever. Noboru Ueno, the prominent Marxist geographer of Japan, points this out in relation to the alienation of the body of the working class from his or her space as follows, quote, the biggest victims of the alienation from material nature are naturally, or mainly the working class. They're swayed by the illusion of quantitative contrast while contemplating that they stand on the basis of their intrinsic use value and direct social relations. It is only when he or she overcomes the illusion and gain a position of direct use value, that is, when the land itself is restored to its original form, he or she would find peace of mind as a common human being. This amounts to grabbing back of the ensemble of space body, which has been transformed into a fantasy to his or her innate property. Close quote. Now, one can sort of extrapolate from that. There is this sense of, the bucolic, for example. You can argue that the emergence of cemeteries as kind of landscapes as opposed to simply rows of bodies buried is forest lawn, for example. You have these kinds of things, and it's not meant for where. I mean, I suppose you would buy your funeral plot in a nice place, or on the other hand, it would be, it's mainly meant for the living in that sense. Anyway, here, Ueno focuses on the alienation and destruction of the autogenous bond of space and body under private ownership. In formulating this tenet, Ueno was inspired by the following statements of Marx in the first manuscript of the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, as well. Quote, "It is just in his work upon the objective world, therefore, that man really proves himself to be a quote-unquote species being." And this species being thing comes up a lot when you do a lot of reading on Marx, particularly on the humanist Marx as opposed to the later Marx. It's not something that Engels gets really into, but it's sort of there. Anyway, this production is his active species life, species-life. Through this production, nature appears as his work and his reality. The object of labor is therefore the objectification of man's species life, species-life. In tearing away from man, the object of this production, therefore, estranged labor tears from him his species life, his real objectivity as a member of the species, and transforms his advantage over animals into the disadvantage that his inorganic body, nature, is taken away from him. So, and this is a reflection, obviously on the earlier Marx of this idea of, ways in which you can explain not only alienation, but also, kind of metabolic approach, as it were, to talking about, why is it that we do what we do? Why is, and to differentiate, labor in a sense that you can conceive of it as being both paid and unpaid, and then, get to the surplus value, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, Ueno showed interest in a humanistic interpretation of Marxism in geography as early as 1972, much earlier than when humanistic geography gained momentum in English-speaking countries. Well, yes and no. There's another way you can argue that. But anyway, a similar point was developed by humanistic geographers in subjective idealism into one of the mainstreams of modern geography, with the understanding of an intersubjectivity and lived space. In Kant's conception, the object of recognition was space itself, but phenomenological geography emphasized the intuitive recognition based on a subjective perception of heterogeneous space filled with materials. So this is this idea that there's stuff there, and you perceive it as having all of these things in it, or whether you're one of a thing in this space. Anyway, it's less pristine in that sense. The primary point of phenomenological geography is that we live in a world composed of perceptions of the environment that surrounds a body, or you're situated, right, in a environment in that sense with your perceptions of it. The space which surrounds us is the lived space, espace vécu, and it is called the life world of the subject, or you could call it a climate. Now, this is not the climate of, rain and snow, etc. But this idea of trying to describe this kind of sense of surrounding or environment, not so meteorological in that sense. However, humanistic geography fails to recognize that the lived space is alienating and does not see inherent conflict and struggle within it. So there's a kind of, you could say blindness or ideological sort of misperception of it. Whereas Ueno states, quote, the ultimate purpose of Marxist choreography. Choreography is a description of the way in which we talk about the divisions of space. Anyway, in terms of units, structural units, is to critically analyze the reality in which the ensemble of space body, space-body, which is the foundation of human existence, is transformed into an illusory objectivity and alienates local human groups under the private ownership system. So this is the transition to feudalism in that sense. Moreover, on the basis of this critical analysis, the Marxist choreography proposes praxis, that is, the action of combining theory and practice, to be carried out against the environment where local human groups are transformed into illusory objects. So it's a little complicated, I would suppose, but you can sort of get the sense that, how you organize yourself in a world has some contingencies or constraints that have to do often with a private ownership system. Indigenous people, so you can see where this is going, right? I hope. Indigenous people legitimately claim and indigenous conceptions of the rights of Mother Nature. This is David Harvey. And in the American context, you can see how that operates. There's just a different perception of what one's cosmic relationship is with nature, and one's dedication to that ideological position, together with alienation from it, which is often used as leverage in social struggles for more rights and independence of indigenous people. So, this is on the one hand problematic, on the other hand not very problematic at all. And it depends on respect and a variety of other things, which some people are purely ignorant of. When it relates to something, back to the text, when it relates to something in the past, it is called collective memories. The collective memories can also develop into the driving force for struggles against those who have attempted to destroy the physical source of memories due to profit motives. It can become the key element in the political strategy of the oppositional groups, especially when it is, quote, so special as to be very hard to trade upon, unquote, as David Harvey. Also, it can sometimes be incorporated into commercialization by global or local capital in a contrived manner. I think we're getting towards Disneyland in that sense. Subsections or section 7.2, the manipulation and alienation of the autogenous bond by state and economic powers. Subsection A, uprooting of the autogenous bond by state power. After agriculture became the mainstay of economic activity, people found and spontaneously occupied space and cultivated into farmland for production, as well as residential areas for their rural communities. As long as agriculture is self-sufficient in the community, the occupation of space by the body would have been a form of spontaneous occupation of terra nullius based on the principle of equality and agreement among community members. At this stage, the autogenous bond of the body, of the subject, and space has not been uprooted. Once private property and a class society are established, this is that move, right, into feudalism, and the ruling class emerges as the ultimate power in ruling the configuration of space. Class society is a regime based on the possession of surplus by the ruling class. And in the pre-capitalistic society, the surplus taking the form of agricultural products is produced by the production space of agriculture that spread across the territory under its domination. So, land grants, etc., homestead, whatever. You can see how some of these things operate. The power of the institution and violence of a state grind down and crush everything before them, with space performing the function of a plane, a bulldozer, or a tank. The original autogenous bond is thus brutally uprooted. In the ancient Asiatic mode of production, one which features, despotism among others, the state power exercised the direct possession and control of the agricultural production space itself, including its associated irrigation facilities produced by the state power, hence hydraulic. The state appropriated all production space from individuals and coordinated the land use. The state power partitions its empire and people territorially, classifying, controlling groups, both large and small, through the control of the area, SAC, to appropriate surplus product from the peasants. See, these are organized because of, value, etc. A good large-scale example is the Jori system based on the Honden Shuju system in Japan, Jori system. The entire production space is subdivided, and the subjects were allocated by the state power as the serfs in one of the subdivided plots for the farm production. In this configuration of production space, the autogenous process of binding one's body to space was distorted and broken by the state power. So it's a redefinition, as we can understand in the emergence of or the move from slavery to the feudal. You see, a local state anyway, as kind of operative. A similar alienation for the autogenous bond between body and space can be found in the enclosure movement by the owner of the surplus in the United Kingdom. This process led former farmers to migrate to the city, and the concomitant creation of proletariats. We've talked about this before. Proletariats in large cities where the autogenous bond with space had been broken. So urban space has exactly that same kind of problem. Although, there's arguments about the relative autonomy of small urban spaces, et cetera, and that's a whole different thing. The artificially superimposed boundaries in Africa and other colonized areas cut through the ethnic space, often leading to migration, which alienates people from the autogenous bond with space. And you can see this, a lot of people don't want to leave where they are, and they don't migrate, for reasons of domination other than being subservient to domination. The desire to have a better life does not necessarily mean that they're going to take stuff from you, which is the way they're still very libertarian. The libertarians don't sort of believe that, they don't get too close to my stuff. On the other hand, in the process of farmer liberation in France and Germany from the end of the 18th century to the beginning of the 19th century, free ownership and sale of land were admitted to farmers and citizens. This is a kind of the disintegration of the larger sort of manorial properties, etc. The people appeared as the principal subject of space ownership and the ultimate agent of land use coordination, free from any forms of slavery. There's this moment at which it's just too problematic to even continue, as slavery is, has its own costs relative to one's responsibility, manorially speaking, of being a quote unquote master of slaves. They can thus build a fresh autogenous bond with the space that they themselves own. Though you can argue that, for example, tenant farming, is a slight, sharecropping, that these are, varied or quasi ownership forms, and one's not without their own problematic elements. Subsection B, relational space contrived and monetized to coerce people. The state intervention and monetization of property relation dissociated the body from space. The entire spatial configuration was subordinated to the unifying but abstract principle of property, which is external and supposedly superior to lived experience. Now, that's an interesting contrast that both its externality, as it were, and a superior relation to lived experience. Lefebvre, and you could say that that's exactly what occurs, right? That land titles to land last longer than you do. The state authority instead attempted to deploy its power to contrive a bond of body with space. In urbanizing medieval Europe, a social and a mental space emerged. According to Lefebvre, the facade in the built environment assumed the role of trumpeting the associated authorities of church, king, and city to the crowds flocking to the porch. Now, lest you think that's unimportant, town squares have not only churches, but they also have clocks. They also have, other things that are part of civic society, et cetera, and they all kind of church, king, and city all intersect in, at least in the European context. Back to the text, geometry and logic of relational space colluded with authority. And you can see this in, sort of the urban histories, and without getting into a long thing, the wrapper of the relational space or facade is given a coercive symbolic meaning by the authority to oppress people psychologically. So even in the case of Haussmann in the 19th century, in terms of redoing Paris, it is creating the boulevard not only gives you the boulevard, but it gives you this continuous facade that masks, as it were, a whole bunch of other little, complicated little nooks and crannies and, alleys and other things, but presents itself as a unified, sort of boulevard facade, which in no way necessarily is as ordered as it might imply. Anyway, and this is worse in sort of the non-Parisian context, where in some cities you can have this sense of the facade, but everything else is just chaos. But it's sort of hidden by it, and it's a kind of Western front, as it were. Anyway, the cities with such facades are alienating places, dissociated from their own rural Heimat. Remember, Heimat is a homeland where the people could still have enjoyed an autogenous bond. The mentality to respect authority is sometimes formed through the creation of a mystical, imaginary configuration of space artificially created by the state power. In the pre-modern era, for example, the autogenous bond with space was often displaced using rituals. Space is mystically infused, for example, in the case of the Chinese four quarters, which was conceived of as the mirror of cosmic order. So you have this kind of projection of, the divine, it's in compass orientation, the kind of axial power in that sense. And so that the world of whatever the spiritual cosmic universe is projected into our environment by reinforcing certain things. You orient the Forbidden City north. It's always going to be north, and you got to figure out where north is. Of course, not too hard once you figure it out. And and then you create a kind of a grid and a Cartesian relation to all of it. Anyway, where the people are alienated and relegated to a mere component of it, this is a geographical variant of the organistic theory of society. In some cases, the idea that society functions like a bodily organ in that kind of sense. Anyway, in some cases, the state power intentionally induces its people to have a bond of body with national land, often instigated by an imperialist motive. For example, in the earlier period of the United States, there was, quote, concerted efforts to keep the relationships between people and place intimate, that is, to create a sense of community. Late 18th and early 19th century American life was full of natural patriotism and love of land. It eventually developed into, quote unquote, manifest destiny, calling for conquering as far as the Pacific coast. State power also takes advantage of that innate bond to divide and fragment the consciousness of the working class. Since the laborers may form allegiances to their neighborhoods and districts rather than to their class. Note that this is, it works both ways, right? It's easier to control all those people because they're in their little neck of the woods or their ghetto or however you want to describe it. Once the market economy managed to commodify space, the property market in general became the organizer of space as it entitles full private ownership of space under proprietary individualism. Space thus becomes the recipient of an accumulation of riches. This is Lefebvre. That is, in carrying out their own production activities and selling their products in the market at their own responsibility, the subjects occupying the space of action as a general condition for production and life are freed from their subordinate relationships in terms of the possession of the space they occupy, and each subject has the right to exclusively own a space with its right of free disposal. That operates in a variety of ways, and the model of the market, the agora, it's it exists in a variety of other things, but we've privileged it in a classical sense as a kind of important kind of model for circulation. In this context, the right of the body to bond with space is interrupted by economic power exercising the market process of the second form of subsuming relational space. So there is interruption, and in this kind of evolutionary accretion, the state cannot normally no longer unilaterally abolish or alter the ownership of space by the individual subject. It's not absolute. Proprietary individualism in the occupation of space is established through the legal apparatus of the nation state appearing to support and administer the mosaic of collective absolute spaces, deploying its state power. The protection of the exclusivity of bounded space and the protection of the land market that creates the configurations of collective absolute spaces are all possible only through the unitary transposition of power to the scale of the bourgeois state apparatus. So you could talk about the Paris Commune perhaps in this way. Here, that is this Mizuoka. Here, an unequal economic and society structure leads to differences in the ability to pay for property, which disrupts the bond of body with space. So ownership relations, or the idea of having collective ownership, is is insurgent or transgressive, or can be. Nevertheless, this power structure has also attempted to confiscate terra nullius and the customary commons with ambiguous exclusive ownership of space was transformed by state power into state ownership. The bond of space and body was thus disrupted and displaced by the state power. Now, you could say that eminent domain is a kind of manifestation of that same feudal kind of relation, and similarly with a kind of larger techno-feudal apparatus. But anyway, 7.3, manipulation of cognitive space by state and economic power. A, the role of monuments. The state can also contrive to enhance its power in the process of generating the bond, the autogenous bond between body and space. A typical case in point is the production of monuments by the state power. You can see this already happening with Trump's Arc de Triomphe in DC. Monuments constitute the strong points, nexuses, or anchors of the web of life of the web of the configuration of space. Anchors of the web of the configuration of space. A monument, which tends to assume the nodal position, that's an intersection, a nodal position in the network of relational space, displaces the autogenous bond of space towards placing something created by the power as an object for the bond. So that's why you put, triumphal arches in places in that sense, or obelisks or whatever. Those in power can thus manipulate the function of these objects to produce the guise of an autogenous bond of the people with the authority, right? That's what Trump is trying to do. Reification and displacement makes places themselves appear to have power and induce those being dominated into accepting the power autogenously and spontaneously by way of the monuments. That's what Trump is trying to do. I mean, he does it so stupidly that it's just, it's laughable on the one hand. On the other hand, he's wasting my and yours and my tax dollars doing, what is just simply an indulgence. Anyway, back to the text. The various facilities representing the state power, such as the palace of a king, or government or court buildings that control society and that sit in a higher order nodal point, can also function as monuments. So facilities representing state power, also function as, so you don't just create a monument which in and of itself, has symbolic power, et cetera, but a function can occur within the context of such structures. As Lefebvre states, quote, monumental space offered each member of a society an image of that membership, an image of his or her social visage, close quote. A monument in space intrudes on and bonds with a body, and the state power represented by the monument becomes embedded as an essential part of the body. So there's a metaphoric thing going on here, right? The body politics, et cetera, et cetera. The imperishability of the will to power is thus implanted to each member of the society. The monument in space thus affected consensus, and this in the strongest sense of the term. Now, these monuments can be incorporated in the process of urban development, such as the palace was placed in the splendid place in the city center, right? It's not anywhere else. It has to be in the center. And the symbol of the spiritual integration, such as a temple or a church, was also placed adjacent to them to raise the prestige and legitimacy of the ruling class. I think, if you'll recall, when Joe from Norway was in Turkey, you could see all those kinds of things operative at night relative to where they were staying and relative to the mosque. And then I found that actually quite interesting to see that, sort of lived in that sense, demonstrated. France, as the colonial suzerain, built Catholic Cathedral St. Joseph in Hanoi, right upon the site of the former Vietnamese spiritual symbol of Buddhist pagoda. In this city, as a stronghold of power, the political rulers of society were those who had the legal right and financial means to plan and redevelop the city which they ruled, taking this as the basis to systematically direct the configuration of the collective absolute spaces of the city as needed. The subordinated subjects were thus alienated from their city, divided and allocated only unilaterally to the urban districts as determined by those in power. I've mentioned a little thing like this that goes on, for example, in Singapore is a good example of that. When a large number of people share a single and common cognitive map, admitting in the monument prestigious value and spiritual sense of belonging to the monument at the spatial node, the intersubjectivity of the living space in the mind of the subjects may direct the behavior of the subjects to sustain the social system dominated by the power, as well as on the process of producing objective spatial configuration. So that's a long way of saying, certain configurations help facilitate social structures in that sense. I think a common example would be in a Dutch city, in some Dutch cities, the position of you know of burghers and other functionaries or capital, rump capitalists, uh, would line where they line? They would organize themselves along or around or near, proximal to the city center, the square, not simply because it was convenient, or that questions of ownership and um, you know congregating, but that it is also symbolic in that particular sense, a class in a class way. And this goes back to the feudal period, or where these things are the result of certain conjunctions of activities, blacksmiths, whatever, grain merchants, whatever. To take examples of urban imagery, the building of the former headquarters of the Japanese colonial government in the former colonial capital of Gyeongsang, Keijo, Seoul, was the place where establishment of the Republic of Korea was proclaimed in August 1948, and subsequently served as the parliament building of the independent Republic of Korea, representing the change of power from the Japanese colonial administration to Korean autonomy. Yet, this site of such historical value to Korean history was later dismantled, since it was considered to be a symbol representing the domination of the former colonial power. You can see how that operates, right? It on the one hand, it had power. On the other hand, it symbolizes not so good power. The former East German government destroyed the Prussian palace in East Berlin, as it was considered a symbol of aristocratic power in the past, and built the socialist GDR parliament building there. Yet, after reunification, the German government decided to destroy the former GDR parliament building and to revive the Prussian palace, suggesting that the socialist past in the eastern part of Germany should not be regarded as authentic and legitimate part of German history. These two episodes suggest that the built form of society is always conflict prone, according to the economic and social organization and power relations. From this, the opposition and strife around the built environment comes about. Subsection B, manipulation of cognitive space by capitalist power. Capitalist power, especially property developers, also manipulate cognitive relative space to maximize profits. Subjective evaluations made for different residential districts occur in a manner disproportionate to geometrical relative space. The subjective evaluation of properties may have negative or positive impacts on real estate values, which promotes or discourages urban residential developments. If a developer succeeds in creating an image that a commercial agglomeration is more attractive than others, people will have a cognitive map accordingly in their mind, and their purchasing behavior would thus be based on this cognitive map. On the other hand, if there's psychological barrier or boundedness in their mind regarded as difficult to overcome, even if it's not in reality, their action space for purchasing behavior can be restricted. Let me break here for a second. There's a building, and this is, you can argue that it's feng shui, et cetera, and instead of having square windows, it had porthole-like windows, or and they weren't perfectly round, and they were more ovoid, I think. And so the vernacular, I suppose there's a term for it in Cantonese, that it's a building of assholes, or rectal orifices. So it had already a negative connotation for largely stupid reasons, but it's sort of interesting to see that. Anyway, the neatly nested hexagonal system of the outcome of the first form of relational space subsumption, is thereby distorted by the profit motive. Thus, property developers and commercial capital seek to transform the value of the cognitive relational space in the mind of the people and to redraw their map to enhance their opportunity for profit. They may resort to economic incentives or an aesthetic sense, both of which may differ from the real utility or value. Gentrification is a typical case in point. It has often been associated with commercial development. When various redevelopment projects are implemented concurrently, the cognitive maps of the people are reconfigured through their strong impact. If a property developer successfully manages to redraw by this means the cognitive maps of the subjects within the action space of the gentrified place, profit will accrue to the developers from the quote unquote rent gap. This will encourage further commercial development and agglomeration. And we've sort of talked about that before in terms of rent and rent seeking. Subsection C, production of non-quotidian space as compensation for alienation. As discussed earlier, space with autogenous bonds with the body is constantly alienated by the state and economic power. It's full of force and repression, of manipulation and co-optation, as Lefebvre. Here, the body seeks to engage in an illusory bond with the space in which the body is situated. Well, anyway, Lefebvre points out concerning the area set aside for leisure, the body regains a certain right to use, a right which is half imaginary and half real, and which does not go beyond an illusory culture of the body, an imitation of natural life. In short, the alienation from the autogenous bond with space is compensated by the bond with a capitalist space of leisure, which is claimed to be rich in natural environment or historical heritage. Skateboarding is a crime. You should, you can't skateboard here, whatever. Tourism is a typical case in point. It is an act of a reinstatement of the body's rights that remain unfulfilled to call for a space with a corresponding restoration of desire and pleasure. For example, a beach, a place of festivity, the space of the dream, and illusory emancipation. The meaning of the space of leisure to the body is therefore the displacement from the quotidian to the non-quotidian through festival, or again, from labor to non-labor through putting into brackets and into questions of toil. In this sense, tourism is a capitalist pursuit to have the people seek a contrived emancipation or ephemeral bond with non-quotidian space. The people spontaneously pay for the cost of transportation and accommodation by themselves for this type of tourist action. A typical example of this behavior to save themselves from alienating quotidian space is the space of Disneyland. Disneyland is a typical non-quotidian festival space where the real question of real toil is set aside. It's a small, small world, right? While it also tacitly functions as an ideological device. Originally built in Anaheim near Los Angeles in 1955, copies popped up in Japan, France, and China. And yes, it does appear like, colonial and imperial in that sense. Disneyland is not just an amusement park for children. No, indeed not. It has its own ideology of society and history and embodies the ideals of frontier expansionism of civilized society to overcome the territories of indigenous people, which Disney regarded as the bastion of savagery and barbarism. Right there, and you get that this is reproduced in Disney narratives. Indeed, the struggle with there's a civilizing discourse and a colonial and sometimes it's displaced into anthropomorphic animal characters, etc., etc. The struggle with real toil is evaporated and replaced with the possibility of infinite expansion of the frontier, or as David Harvey talks about, a spatial fix. Take the example of Tokyo Disneyland. After entering the main gate, turn left at the World Bazaar, an early American-style shopping arcade, and tour the themed areas clockwise. The first is, and this mimics Disneyland itself, right? The first is Adventureland, which contains Africa, the Jungle Cruise, and Asia, Shiba Traders, which is the prefectural government requested when Disney planned to construct Disneyland in Shiba Prefecture, where it is actually situated. So This is reproduction of power, right? There are the ideals of savage and barbarism represented in non-European indigenous American worlds such as Latin America, the pirates of the Caribbean, right? Who commit atrocities. That's why we blow them up in their little boats. And not the Taliban, but they do represent barbarism, which needs to be overcome. Next comes Western land, or in the frontier land in the original Disney, where the images of mining railways in the West and the Mississippi River boats are represented in which civilization and enlightenment gradually spread throughout the frontier of the U.S., expanding to the West. The contemporary economy and society as the outcome of the frontier expansion to the whole world is symbolized by Fantasyland. The contemporary world, rife with struggles and wars, is best concealed by the attraction relocated from the World's Exposition of New York in 1964, the happiest cruise in the world, in which all ethnic people, it's a small, small world, ethnic peoples in the world sing and dance in a song called It's a Small World, made in the U.S., right? And you recall that it is parodied, yes, in Shrek. Visitors would innocently believe that the integration of the world's territories with the U.S. at the core brings happiness and harmony to the peoples of the space technology developed by the U.S., an infinite future appearing geographically as a dynamic and progressive relationship between peoples and events on the one hand, and territorial molds on the other. This is Robert Sack. As such, in Disneyland, all the socioeconomic conflicts and contradictions at home, are put into bracket, concealed from the cognition of visitors, and replaced it with the illusory emancipation outward into infinitely open space, while the US-centered harmony created through overcoming barbarism is celebrated at home. By spending non-quotidian leisure time, visitors are tacitly indoctrinated in the global ideology that the state power of this is cultural imperialism, right? State power of the US expects everyone in the world to have generally, and Walt Disney Productions profit from it. Through this, and unless you think that's unimportant, Epcot is an entire, has a whole imperial hegemonic utopian thing going on. Through this cultural device, leisure thus actually encourages that enemy, actually helps to revive it. Naturally, those oppressed also have a right to create a non-quotidian configuration of space. The most typical of all is the Occupy movement, finally. It ingeniously created a virtual bond with public space. Those activists claiming to represent 99% of people occupy the public space, showing their way of producing an autogenous bond with what the authority claims is quote unquote public. You know how problematic that is. And, Occupy New York, or Wall Street had that kind of issue. That it was interesting to take over what ostensibly was private space, but also to get moved around into quasi-public and private space. So anyway, to demonstrate the collective power of bodies in public space is still the most effective instrument of opposition. David Harvey. Yes and no. I mean, you can have a big demonstration, but what finally happens? So anyway, we're at the end. Chapter 9 of this book discusses more issues related to alternative space. So in this chapter, he's given a whole bunch of sort of intersecting ideas about what the context of space is. I'll discuss that on Wednesday as well. And so I'm going to stop yakking since I've come to the end of my time, and other things have to occur. So let me thank you for your indulgence, and I will stop the, come on.